The back doors were propped open, not unlocked, not left that way by a careless latch or a door that swung loose in the night air. Props open, deliberately. And they were still that way when her daughter arrived hours later. For 60 days, an entire country had been watching the front of this house. The doorbell footage, the iron security gate, the blood on the step, the figure in the ski mask at 1:47 in the morning, tapping the camera lens with a kind of calm that does not belong to someone who is improvising. That is where the attention went. That is where the investigation anchored itself. The front. Always the front. But nobody was looking at the back. Stick with me, because this is where things get really strange. My name is not important. What matters is this. When a journalist named Brian Anton flew back to Tucson and put a drone up behind Nancy Guthrie's property, for the first time in 60 days, the country got a clear look at something that had been sitting there the entire time. And what that drone found did not match what almost anyone had assumed was back there. Now here is why that matters. When you picture the back of a desert home, a home of that era, in a neighborhood like the Catalina foothills, you probably picture something reasonable. A patio maybe, sliding glass panels opening out toward the mountains, an outdoor living space with a view. That is the assumption most people made. That assumption shaped every theory about how this crime was committed, and that assumption was wrong. 3 doors, not sliding glass, 3 separate hinged doors on the back of Nancy Guthrie's house, 2 connected directly to the interior of the home, 1 positioned near the garage. Regular wooden doors with paned glass windows set into the upper half of the frame. Doors that swing outward into the darkness. Doors that can be held open if you put something against them. And that is when things started to feel off. Because Savannah Guthrie had already told the country something important. When Annie and Tommaso arrived at that house on the morning of February 1st, those back doors were propped open. Not one door. Doors, plural. Deliberately held in the open position, and Annie's first thought, the explanation her mind reached for before she understood what she was actually looking at, was that maybe paramedics had come in the night. Maybe her mother had a medical episode. Maybe someone with a stretcher had used the back entrance. That is what it looks like when you are a daughter who has not yet understood what you are walking into. What she was actually walking into was the aftermath of something planned, something that required those doors to stay open, something that needed a specific entry point secured before anyone ever set foot inside that house. And here is where the picture starts to shift in a way that the front door footage alone never could have shown us. A former Puma County SWAT commander, a man named Bob Kroger, who spent nearly 3 decades running tactical operations in that exact desert, in that exact jurisdiction, walked the terrain behind Nancy's property this week. He was there to do what a professional does: assess the ground, read the environment, and give an honest evaluation of what it would have taken to move someone through it. He stepped into the brush behind the house, and within seconds, he lost his sense of direction. Now think about that for a moment, because that detail is easy to move past, and it should not be. This is not someone who gets turned around easily. This is a man who has led SWAT callouts in desert terrain for 3 decades. A man who knows this environment the way most people know their own neighborhood. He lost his bearings almost immediately after entering the natural cover behind a residential property. Something does not add up. And that is exactly where we need to start. Because what the terrain behind that house actually looks like, what it feels like to stand inside it, is nothing like what 60 days of front-facing coverage had prepared anyone to imagine. From the street, from any angle that surveillance equipment or news cameras had captured, the Catalina foothills looks exactly like what it is supposed to look like. A quiet, established desert neighborhood, large lots, mature vegetation, privacy and beauty in every direction. The kind of place where people have lived for decades, and where nothing moves at 2 in the morning that does not belong. But from inside the brush, from the exact position Kroger stepped into behind Nancy's property, it is an entirely different environment. Dense vegetation that in some cases has been growing for 60 years. Cactus with thorns that tear through clothing and skin without warning. Rocky ground that shifts underfoot in the dark. Visibility that drops to almost nothing once you are more than 20 feet inside the natural cover. And rattlesnakes. Kroger mentioned this almost in passing. that were starting to move as the season warmed. That is what sits behind her house. That is the terrain that someone would have had to know, had to be comfortable in, if they approached this property from the back. Now here's what the front of the house had already told us, because we need to hold both pictures at the same time to understand what the new information actually means. February 1st, 2026. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a figure appears on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera. Ski mask, 1:47 a.m. The figure taps the camera lens, not frantically, not in a panic, twice, with a kind of ease that does not fit the moment. Then at some point after that, the camera is removed from its mount entirely, not disabled remotely, not disrupted by a signal, physically pulled from the wall by a hand that reached up and took it down. The blood on the front step is Nancy's, confirmed, and it is not the blood of someone who was standing there voluntarily. Annie and Tommaso arrived that morning and found the back doors open and their mother gone. And for 60 days, that front-facing footage, that doorbell image, that blood, that iron security gate, became the frame through which the entire country tried to understand what happened. But here is the problem. The front was the exit, not the entry. And when you understand that, when the drone footage and Kroger's ground-level assessment are placed next to everything the front door footage had already shown us, the geography of this crime looks completely different than the way most people have been picturing it. The operation came in through the back. It moved through the interior of that house in total darkness, and it left through the front with Nancy, and never returned. The back doors were still propped open at dawn because nobody went back through them. The people who moved through that house exited one way, and one way only. And what was left behind? The open doors, the blood, the pulled camera, the absence of Nancy Guthrie, is the physical record of a night that 60 days of investigation has not yet fully resolved. What happened next, what Kroger found when he actually walked that ground and gave his professional assessment, was not what most people expected to hear. And that is where this case gets complicated in a way that the press conferences have never quite addressed. Kroger's assessment of whether someone could have moved Nancy out through the back of that property was direct. He did not hedge it the way people hedge things when they are trying to be careful with their words. He said it was highly improbable. Not impossible. He was clear about that distinction, but highly improbable. And the reasons he gave are specific enough that they deserve to be understood one at a time. First, the noise. Moving through that terrain at night, even for someone who knows it, generates sound. Branches, rocks shifting underfoot. The unavoidable snap and crunch of desert brush that does not move quietly under any conditions. In a neighborhood like the Catalina foothills, where the lots are large and the houses are set back, and the residents have lived there long enough that every dog knows every normal sound, anything that does not belong alerts immediately. Kroger knows this the way someone knows it from experience, not from theory. He said it himself. If you are moving through terrain like that in the dark, the dogs in every property along your route are going to tell on you before you get anywhere near a vehicle. Second, the physical reality of moving Nancy herself. She weighs approximately 150 pounds. She cannot walk on her own. She was in her pajamas with no shoes. To move her through that brush, over rocks, through thorns, in total darkness, while managing direction and noise and time, you would need to carry her. And carrying dead weight of that size through terrain that fights back at every step is not something you do quickly or quietly. Kroger said it plainly. It would draw attention. It would leave traces. There is simply no practical exit from that property in that direction with a person who cannot move under their own power. But here is the third point, and this is the one that connects everything to the front door and the blood on that step. The dogs in the neighboring property woke up that night. Around the time the cameras went offline, they were up and alert, staring in the direction of Nancy's house. The owners noticed. The dogs never did that. They were not barking at nothing. Kroger's read on that, based on decades of moving through residential environments in the field, is straightforward. Dogs in a quiet neighborhood at 2 in the morning are pointing at exactly what they detect. Something moving. Something disturbing the silence that had no business being there. And the direction they were facing was not the back of the property. It was not the wash. It was not the brush. It was not the dense terrain that sits behind those 3 hinged doors. They were facing the front. The same direction as the blood. The same direction as the pulled camera. The same direction as the figure in the ski mask who tapped the lens with a calm that, the more you think about it, does not belong to someone encountering that camera for the first time. Every piece of physical evidence from that night points in the same direction. The dogs, the blood, the camera. The propped doors left open behind an operation that never came back through them. Back entry, front exit. And that is when the real question starts to take shape. Because once you accept that picture, once you let that geography settle into place, something else comes into focus that this investigation has never quite confronted publicly. To move through the interior of a dark house at 2 in the morning, to navigate from a back door to a bedroom to a front entrance without turning on lights, without getting disoriented, without triggering any kind of response that stopped you before you reached Nancy. You have to know that house. Not from a photograph, not from a map, not from standing outside it in the dark and guessing which door leads where. You have to know it the way you know a place you have been inside many times, the way a familiar space gets encoded in your body through repetition until you can move through it without thinking, until the path from the back entrance to the front door is not something you navigate. It is something you remember. And that detail, that specific, quiet, deeply uncomfortable detail, is where this case stops being about geography and starts being about something else entirely. Something does not add up. And what does not add up usually has a reason. Think about what kind of access produces that level of knowledge. Not surveillance access. Not the kind of familiarity you build by driving through a neighborhood a few times or studying a property from the street. We're talking about the kind of access that comes from being inside a place repeatedly, over months, over years, until the interior stops being something you have to think about and starts being something you simply know. Which door leads to which room? Where the light switches are. How the back of the house connects to the front. The path between them, in the dark, under pressure, carrying weight. Executed without hesitation. That is not research. That is not preparation in the conventional sense. That is the kind of knowledge that only time inside a specific place can produce. And here is where the case takes on a different kind of weight. Nancy Guthrie was not a woman who lived in isolation. She had family. She had people who moved through that home regularly, for dinners, for visits, for the ordinary rhythms of a life lived close to the people you love. 20 years of that. 20 years of the same people moving through the same house, learning the same layout, building the mental map of that interior the way you build any mental map, not by trying to memorize it, but simply by being there enough times that it stops being unfamiliar. The back entrance, the front entrance, the path between them. For someone with that kind of history in that house, that path would not feel like navigation. It would feel like muscle memory. Now, before we go any further, and I want to be precise here because precision matters in a case like this, Tommaso Chioni has been officially cleared as a suspect by the Puma County Sheriff's Department. That clearance is on the record. No member of the Guthrie family has been charged with any crime. None of them have been named as suspects by any law enforcement agency. Those facts are stated clearly and they stand. But here is the problem. A press conference does not make a question disappear, and the question that the physical evidence keeps returning to, quietly, persistently, in the way that uncomfortable questions tend to return, is not a question about guilt. It is a question about access, about who had the kind of interior knowledge this operation required, about who knew that specific property well enough to execute a back entry front exit plan in total darkness, without a single moment of hesitation or disorientation. That question does not go away because an official statement was made. If anything, it goes deeper with every new forensic detail that confirms just how precisely this was planned. And then there is the camera. This is the detail that has been sitting inside the doorbell footage since the beginning. And it is one of those things that looks different once you know what to look for. The figure in the ski mask appears on the porch at 1:47 in the morning. And before that camera is removed from its mount, before it is physically pulled from the wall by a hand that reached up and took it down. The figure taps the lens twice. Not frantically, not in a rush, with a kind of casual ease that is hard to explain if you try to place it in the context of what that moment actually was. Think about what that moment was. This person is standing on the front porch of a home. They are in the process of entering as part of a crime. The camera is recording them, and their response to that camera is not panic. It is not urgency. It is a tap. Twice. The gesture of someone who has interacted with that camera before. That detail changes everything about how we read that footage, because there is a difference. A very specific behavioral difference between someone who disables a camera because they are afraid of what it might capture, and someone who removes it because they know exactly where it is, exactly what angle it covers, and exactly how to take it down. One of those behaviors belongs to a stranger. The other belongs to someone for whom that camera was not new. Kroger noticed this during the walkthrough. He pointed out something else, too, that the neighborhood vegetation, the same dense brush that made the back terrain nearly impassable, also blocked the sightlines of neighboring cameras. The residential security systems that law enforcement had been pulling footage from for 60 days. Many of those angles are obstructed by 60 years of desert growth sitting between the lens and the view. What looks like comprehensive camera coverage on a map or a satellite image is, at ground level, a patchwork of blind spots created by the same natural privacy that makes the Catalina foothills beautiful to live in. And if whoever planned this knew about those blind spots, knew which cameras could see the approach and which ones could not, knew which angles were clear, and which were blocked by trees that have been growing in those yards for decades, then what we are looking at is not just knowledge of the house, it is knowledge of the entire environment surrounding it. This is where things start to feel off in a way that is hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Because there is a word for the kind of familiarity that accounts for camera angles and dog positions and neighborhood silence windows and interior layouts and exit routes all at once. That word is not research. And it is not coincidence. Let us slow down for a moment and think about what kind of mind plans something like this. Not the what, the how. The specific sequence of decisions that had to be made before February 1st ever arrived, because that is what the physical evidence is actually describing when you read it carefully enough. Someone identified the back of that property as the entry point. That decision was not made in the moment. You do not arrive at the back of a house in the dark at 2 in the morning and decide on the spot to prop the doors open. You think of that in advance. You think of it because you have already imagined the scenario, already walked through it in your mind, and you recognized a specific vulnerability in your plan. What if the door closes behind me and auto-locks? What if I need to move quickly back the way I came and I cannot? What if the one variable I did not account for is a mechanism I have no control over once I am inside? So you remove that variable before you go in. You place something against the door. You ensure that the route you entered from stays accessible for the full duration of whatever you are doing inside that house. That is not improvisation. That is contingency planning. And contingency planning requires you to have already imagined failure, which means you were thinking about this long before the night it happened. Every layer of this operation points to the same conclusion. A person who made a series of decisions in the days or weeks before the dark, and then executed them with a steadiness that is, in its own way, the most unsettling part of this entire case. Because here's what steadiness in a moment like that actually requires. It requires that you have already made peace with what you are about to do. The hesitation, the moment where a person might stop, might reconsider, might feel the weight of what they are standing inside. That moment was not present on that porch. The tap on the camera, the deliberate removal, the clean exit through the front. None of that is the behavior of someone who is struggling with the reality of what was happening. That behavior belongs to someone for whom the decision had already been finalized long before 1:47 in the morning. And Kroger said something near the end of his walkthrough that has not received the attention it deserves. He was asked directly whether he still believes this case will be solved. And he said yes, absolutely, without hesitation. But then he added something that the simple yes does not carry on its own. He said it might not be solved for a year, or 2 years, or 5, or 10, but it will be solved. Now think about the way he said that. This is a man who spent nearly 30 years inside the institutional machinery of the department that is managing this investigation. He knows how cases like this move. He knows when evidence is building quietly towards something, and he knows when a case is genuinely stalled. And he did not say, "This will wrap up soon." He did not say the DNA closes it in the next few weeks. He gave a range that stretched to a decade. And then he said it will be solved. Not might, not probably, will. There is a specific kind of weight that lives in that word, when it comes from someone who has earned the right to use it carefully. The forensic threads are moving whether anyone is paying attention or not. The DNA is being processed. Genealogy is building family trees from whatever biological material was recovered from that property. Cell tower data is being cross-referenced against the timeline of that night. 4 detectives and a sergeant are working this case, and only this case, every day, inside a federal building in Tucson that does not hold press conferences about what it knows. And on a Tuesday morning this week, a drone went up behind an 84-year-old woman's house in the Catalina foothills and showed the country something it had not seen in 60 days of coverage. 3 doors, dense brush, rattlesnakes. Terrain so difficult that a former SWAT commander lost his sense of direction within seconds of entering it. And back doors that were propped open, deliberately, specifically, operationally, by someone who had thought through every variable of that night before the night ever came. Now we need to come back to the front porch, because that is where Nancy's story inside her home ends. And it is where the next question, the one this investigation has not publicly answered, has to begin. The blood on that step is hers. Confirmed. It is not the blood of someone who walked to their front door voluntarily at 2 in the morning. It is the blood of a woman who is being moved, carried, through her own front entrance against her will. A woman in her pajamas, no shoes. Someone who on a good day could barely walk to her mailbox. Being transported through her own front door by at least one person who had entered through the back, navigated the interior in darkness, and reached her before anyone in that neighborhood knew anything was wrong, and pressed into that blood on the step, identified by a board-certified bloodstain pattern expert, is what appears to be a footwear impression, not Nancy's. She had no shoes. Someone else's soul, pressed into blood on the front step of her home at 2 in the morning. The physical trace of a person standing in blood they did not create, standing in it as the final moments of an operation they had planned for weeks reached their conclusion. That impression is not a theory. It is a forensic artifact. It is the kind of detail that does not disappear when the press moves on or the news cycle shifts. It stays. It gets analyzed. It gets compared. And eventually, in a year or 2 years or 5 or 10, it becomes part of the answer. But here's what I keep coming back to, and this is less about the forensics and more about something quieter, something behavioral, that has been sitting underneath this case since the very first morning. The back doors were still propped open when Annie arrived, hours after the operation had ended, hours after Nancy was gone. They were still open because nobody went back through them. The people who moved through that house that night left one way, through the front, and they did not return to close what they had opened behind them. And I think about what that means for a moment, not forensically, but humanly, because someone propped those doors before they went in. Someone thought, I need this open when I come back if something goes wrong. And then something did not go wrong. The plan executed. And they left through the front, and they never came back. And the doors stayed open. In the desert dark, through the rest of that night into the morning, because the person who opened them was gone. That image, those doors still open at dawn, in terrain that a SWAT veteran could not navigate in seconds, is the clearest picture this case has produced of what February 1st actually was. Not a crime of opportunity, not a moment of impulse. A plan, executed by someone who knew exactly where they were going, inside that house and out of it, because they had been there before, many times. And that is the question that has never been more important than it is right now. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 58 days. Her family cannot grieve. They cannot hold a service or gather around something final, or begin the slow and painful work of processing a loss. They can only wait. In that particular kind of suspension that exists between not knowing and knowing, a space that has no name, but that anyone who has lived inside it will recognize immediately. Savannah is returning to the Today Show. Annie and Tommaso have been cleared. The investigation continues behind closed doors in a building in Tucson where the work does not stop because the cameras have moved on. The DNA is still being processed. The genealogy is still building. The cell tower data is still being cross-referenced against a timeline that began sometime before 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, and has not yet found its end. And a drone that went up behind a quiet desert property this week showed the country something it had spent 60 days not seeing. The back of that house looks nothing like what anyone assumed. The terrain behind it is dense and disorienting and unforgiving in a way that ground-level presence makes undeniable. The 3 doors, hinged, wooden, opening outward into desert darkness, sit at the edge of an environment that a former SWAT commander described as some of the most difficult ground he has ever tried to move through. And those doors were propped open on the morning of February 1st by a person who had thought through exactly why they needed to stay that way. Back entry, front exit, camera removed. Blood on the step. Nancy carried out in her pajamas into a desert night that has not given her back. These are not theories anymore. These are the documented forensic facts of February 1st, 2026, assembled now in a geographic context that the drone footage and Kroger's ground-level assessment have made possible to understand completely for the first time. And what sits at the center of all of it? The detail that the evidence keeps returning to, no matter which thread you pull, is the question of access, not surveillance access, not research access. The kind of access that encodes a house in your body, that makes a back door and a front door, and the dark path between them feel less like a route and more like a room you have always known. The investigation has not publicly answered that question, and the forensic science is still working toward it. But the ground-level evidence, the terrain, the doors, the camera, the blood, the dogs facing the front, the operation that entered one way and left another and never returned, all of it points toward a picture that is getting clearer with every piece of new information. Kroger said it will be solved, and I believe him. But I also think about something that has nothing to do with forensics and everything to do with the way this crime was carried out. There is a specific kind of distance required to plan something like this against someone you know. Not physical distance. The opposite of that. The person who planned this was close. Close enough to know the layout of that house in the dark. Close enough to know the camera. Close enough to know the neighborhood. The silence. The dogs. The blind spots in the vegetation where the cameras do not reach. And yet somewhere inside all of that closeness, a decision was made. A cold and deliberate and fully formed decision. Made not in a moment of anger or impulse, but over time, in advance. With the kind of careful thought that leaves propped doors and clean exit routes, and a footwear impression in blood on a front step at 2 in the morning. That is the part of this case I cannot stop thinking about. Not just what was done, but what it required, internally, psychologically, to do it to someone you had known for years. Someone whose house you had walked through enough times that you did not need a light to find your way out. That kind of distance from another person, from someone real, someone present in your life, does not arrive suddenly. It builds, quietly. And by the time it reaches February 1st, it has already been there for a long time. Somewhere between those propped back doors and wherever Nancy Guthrie is right now, is the full story of that night, and the question of who opened those doors, and what it cost them nothing to open them, has never been more important than it is right now. We do not tell you what to think. We show you what does not fit. And right now, a lot does not fit. Notebook. The thanks you for watching this one all the way through. And genuinely, that means something. Cases like this need people who are willing to slow down and look at the details that everyone else moves past. If something in this video shifted the way you see this case, drop it in the comments. What is the detail that you cannot stop thinking about? Subscribe if you are not already here, and we will see you in the next one.